If you're on my YouTube page, please consider liking the page, subscribe, like, and share with others. Just the same way on my YouTube, on my Facebook page. And I pray that, some of these teachings are edifying to you and help you understand the Bible a little bit better. Today, we're going to tackle a very interesting type topic. Now, again, the motivation behind this teaching is not to create issues or controversies per se. So everything's controversial when you're dealing with Torah and Torah people and, dealing with terms and definitions. But we're going to look at the word Christian in its cultural background. It's not designed to attack anybody in any way. But in my research, I've studied certain things in cultural background when I went to Turkey, Greece, and Rome. And I noticed that the word Christian was called by certain people in a certain time frame. But then later on in the Greco-Roman world, the word Christian was adapted into a subgroup, a tribe. But yet, in the beginning of the first century, in the first part of the, after the resurrection of Yeshua, the word, the way, was directed towards a sect called the Nazarene. And then the word Christian was a word coined by certain people in the Greco-Roman world. And I found that very interesting, that it was considered a sect in the first part of the first century, after the destruction of the temple, specifically during the time of the book of Revelation, when it's approximately written. Now the word Christian takes a different connotation. It goes from what is called a sect, and then Josephus considers it a tribe. And there's a distinct language, because we can now prove, according to the definition of those terms, and also in the first century, that the believers in Yeshua went through a process of legality. Legality within the umbrella of the privileges given to the Jews in the Roman Empire, because there were some privileges given to them. And afterwards, in the time of Josephus, in the time of Domitian, in the time of the persecution of believers, because they did not want to worship imperial worship of the what you may call the Roman Empire, the imperial cult, then it takes a different legality. Now, later on, about 2.5, 3 centuries after Yeshua, then you have Christianity becomes the religion of the kingdom. So now they're trying to abandon imperial worship. They're not worshiping the emperor anymore. The emperor becomes the high priest. And then now the religion, it becomes syncretism, is mixture with everything. But the status of Christianity becomes legal within the kingdom. But we're only focusing in the first 150 years. We're going to narrow our view on the definitions of what Christianity was in the first century, after the destruction of the temple. I don't know why this keeps sounding here. Let me close this. Give me a second, guys. Okay, after the destruction of the temple, and also after the mission after the book of Revelation. There's a window. There's from the year 70 all the way to year 100. We're going to use the 30 years. Everything changed in the status of the believers, but we're going to try to show that today. Okay, we're going to try to show you with some evidence here from cultural backgrounds, and I have some resources, and I'm going to show you with evidence why I don't call myself a Christian today, but maybe I would have called myself a Christian in the late first century. But I definitely would have been called the way in the early half of the first century, immediately after the resurrection of Yeshua. And the question would be, do the believers, the sect of the Jews, the Nazarene, that they're called the way, were they actually a subgroup of the Jewish and Israelite, the sect of the Pharisees and the sect of the Sadducees and the Herodians and different group sets within the Greco-Roman world? The question would be, does Christianity as a major umbrella, let's talk about Catholic Church first, do they represent the original model in the first 30 years during the time of Paul, the disciples, the apostles? And the question begs to be asked, did the disciples ever call themselves Christians? Did Peter call himself a Christian? Or was he using an encouragement to the diaspora in Asia Minor in First Peter that they were being actually persecuted or shamed by the name Christianus? And I'm going to explain what that is. And he's actually saying, if they're calling you that, just, don't be ashamed. Actually, deal with it, because we are the way. So this is one of the reasons why I began to do more research, and I'm starting to believe that the believers in Yeshua should call ourselves the way, because that's the original name. So instead of arguing about terms and people assuming that you're attacking their relationship with God, that's not the point of the teaching. I know many Christian people who are great people. I know many Jewish people that are amazing people. I know many people in the Messianic movement that are really great people, as well as in the Hebrew roots, which I'm removing myself from due to all the controversies and the things going on. So what I'm deciding to do is, okay, how can I have many things in common with them, but yet understand where we were in the first century? The reality is that today's what we see today as a representation of who the Messiah is not the same as it was in the first century. No one can deny that. In the first century, the people of the way kept the Sabbath and the feast, and they obeyed the Torah. They were actually a sect, a subgroup of the Jews, and they were considered as such by the Romans. It wasn't until much later that they were removed from collegia. They were removed because the Jews kicked them out, kicked the believers out, that then they became a tribe, a subgroup. Okay, but there's a distinction. If you notice the time frame and the understanding of times and the history, you'll be able to see this. So, although like I said earlier, I recognize many Christian people are very high quality human beings. No one doubts that. And here, salvation is not in question, because salvation is only given by God, and He's the one who determines who is saved or not. But why would I not call myself a Christian today? And not minimizing the people. Please understand, it's the system of religion. Why would I not call myself a Christian today? I'm not Jewish because I'm not in the religion. I was not born into a Jewish home, so I cannot say I'm Jewish either. But would I be more historically accurate if I say I'm a follower of the way, because we can validate that in the Bible, that it was actually used by disciples and the apostles. By the apostles. And the reason is because we can trace the history, and we know that in the first century, the closer to the resurrection was, the more they identified with the Jewish observance in the first century. They had no other choice, because of some of the things that I'm going to mention here in a minute. So I'm going to take my time and try to basically dissect this topic, and I don't know if you ever thought about it, or maybe without arguments, because everyone argues all the time. But this doesn't take away the fact that Yeshua is the Messiah. It's just that I cannot conform to the definition of the word Christian that has departed from the original lifestyle that it was done in the first century. That's my point. So we're going to investigate, and we're going to find out really the context here, so we can have a better balance without pointing fingers. Because again, the fact that many people on the other side of the aisle are amazing people, that doesn't mean that the title is correct. It's just like, many people who are Orthodox, they're incredible people. Not all of them hate believers in Yeshua. Many of them are very open to dialogue and trying to find out where we're at and what we do. Interesting, though, however, that lately in the last 5 years, when I have Orthodox ask me what I believe without compromising my beliefs, because I believe Yeshua is everything the Bible says. But for some reason, when I talk to them and they see the people that are going to Israel and they see how I live, that I'm not Orthodox, but I'm observant, they wonder, wait a minute, how come others don't do what you're doing? So that's really what we're trying to understand. Terms, without having to get into this tug of war of feelings, we're just going to go to the information. That's not minimizing anyone's salvation. It's to understand the proper terms used in the proper seasons and the proper time. Thus, Christian name today represents, pay attention to this one, represents the lifestyle that a believer of the way, which they called a sect, did in the first century? That's the question. If it doesn't line up in action, not words, but in action and observance on obedience, then would it be okay to call ourselves a Christian when today's definition of Christianity is far removed from the obedience of what Yeshua did and observed, and what Paul did and observed, and what Peter did and observed? That's really the argument or the thesis that I'm trying to present to you, okay? So I pray that makes sense to you. So let's go right into the information. All right, so the first thing is defining terms. I prepared everything like a type of a structured outline so we can study together. The name Christian in the Greco-Roman world, considering how it emerged, how they used it in that legal context and what it meant. So the name Christian, so you get an idea as you can read here with me. Okay, the name Christian from the Greek Christianus, the term Christianus, appears very limited in the sources in the first century. In the New Testament, it is recorded in 3 occasions. So this is something that I really want you to consider. It is found in 3 places. Now, in the 3 places, one is said in irony. The other one is used, and I'll show you how they were used in a minute. And when Peter used it, he's trying to encourage the people saying, if they called you by that name, don't be ashamed. Embrace it. There's not much you can do. Because did you know that the word Christianos became a term that was given to the followers of Messiah as a derogatory type context in the first century? That's a fact. Now, the argument here is not whether or not you think it's right or not to call yourself a Christian. The question was, did the believers or the disciples ever call themselves Christians? Or did they observe the same things Christians observe today as a religion, not as individuals, but as a religion, what they propose and what they teach? That's the question. So let's look into more information here. It says the term Christian appears to be limited in sources. In the first century, in the New Testament, is recorded in 3 occasions. Antioch, and you see this in Acts 11:26, says, when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for an entire year, they met with the church, that's ecclesia, and taught a great many people. And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. The question is, who called them? It was not themselves giving themselves that name. It was in Antioch. In the mouth of Agrippa, in Acts 26:28, Agrippa said to Paul, are you so quickly persuading me to becoming a Christian? Now remember, it was not Paul who said it. He actually said the opposite, which I belong to the way which they call a sect. We're going to go there in a minute. And in 1 Peter chapter 4:16, in the exhortation of 1 Peter 4:16, which he says, yet if any of you suffer as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace. I want you to pay attention to this part of the text. But glorify God because you bear this name. Well, which name is he talking about? Christian, suffering. Why? Because it became a term of derogatory manner to them. It was a derogatory name under the Greco-Roman world, because in Judea, by the Jews, they were called the Nazarenes, but the believers called themselves Doei Hashem, based on Isaiah. Okay, based on 2 verses in the book of Isaiah. Okay? Now, let's continue. The origin and formulation of linguistics. Let me share something here. I got more notes within the notes. The context of in the New Testament and the Greco-Roman world. I missed one letter there. I apologize. In the Greco-Roman world, it says Christians. They were called Christians for the first time in Antioch. The verb charismatisai, to receive a name, to be called officially. Remember, that's in Antioch. So they received a name. Officially in the Greco-Roman world, they knew them as Christians, followers of their anointed Christ, or their Christ. It implies that the name came from outside, possibly from local administration or surrounding area, Hellenistic Antioch. Now in Acts 26:28, Agrippa, he was trying to tell Paul that he was being persuaded to become a Christian. Well, it is used with irony or disdain in judicial context because there was a court case that they were hearing about Paul. It was a court case. He was trying to defend his case. That's when he appealed to Caesar. Okay? Now, the third one is in 1 Peter, if you suffer as Christians, glorify in this name. Meaning, the first place was redefined positively to as an identity, owning the identity. Interesting that 1 Peter is writing exactly to the community where Antioch was located. Asia, Cappadocia, Bithynia. These are provinces. All these were provinces in the first century, and Antioch or Pisidia is actually one of them provinces. Okay? So understand that the word Christian, if we go to the literal context in the first century, was not something that believers call themselves, but that the outside world perceived them. Now, we need to realize one thing, because I heard this guy who's an apologist for the Baptists in the Spanish world. He made a very interesting comment. He said, he's creating havoc, by the way. And he said, well, there's not one piece of evidence that the Gentiles observe the feast and the Sabbath. And I'm going like, well, but that makes no sense. Because it's something that's called collegia. Do you know what collegia is? In the first century, there were some exemptions that the emperor gave the Jews. And because the Jews considered the way a sect from within their own branch, then they had the same privileges of meeting and the same things that I'm going to mention to you in a minute under the umbrella of the Jews in all of Asia Minor, Greece, and also Rome. Now we're talking about from the destruction of the temple, from the resurrection of Yeshua until around the year 70. Around that time, specifically during the time of Paul, things began to shift. But in the first 20 years, everyone who believed in Yeshua, the only place that they could meet for worship was a regular synagogue because of the laws of Rome of what is called religio licita, which is a legal religion. Okay, so basically, they have to be affirmed by the government that they had the right of gathering. Let me share with you the privileges that the Jews had, that the believers in Yeshua enjoyed in the first part of the first century after the resurrection of Yeshua. This is very important because Acts 15 tells us that Moses is read throughout all generations in the synagogue on Shabbat. So literally the letter that James gave Paul with the two witnesses and the elders going through all the congregations is that basically Paul was speaking on behalf of the council in Jerusalem in the Sabbath, in the synagogues. So therefore, the evidence is there. And if you look into the laws of collegia, or the laws of gathering, then you will know that the Jews were the only people outside of imperial worship that were not forced to worship the gods of the Romans. And they had certain privileges that only follow them if they were within their own subgroup. So therefore, the believers in Yeshua, they will grab themselves into that subgroup until later in Acts 17, when Paul went into Thessalonica and he told them about Yeshua, and some of them, they didn't want to believe. What did they do? I'm going to read you the text in a little while. They went to Jason's house and they pulled him out. Okay? And they actually gathered the leadership of the Jews. They gathered some of the people in the marketplace. They gathered some of the regular locals to make the accusation against Paul and the believers. Because preaching another Caesar, preaching another Lord, very important, another king, and the decrees of Rome. I don't know if you've ever heard about the decrees of Rome. You need to the decrees of Caesar. You need to consider this when you look into this information. So I want to read to you the privileges that the Jews received in the first century. Allow me here real quickly to share some of the information. so we understand it better. These are some of the privileges, and you can find them in some of the sources that in Antiquities of the Jews, Antiquity 14, book 14, chapter 14. And then now let me list them for you. First, the emperors gave the Jews the freedom of assembly, right to gather in synagogues, legally functioning like a recognized collegium. Josephus talks about this. And by the way, 1 Corinthians talks about this in the book of Acts, when in the book of Acts also, when Paul was taken to Gallio in Corinth, and Gallio says, leave me alone, just deal according to your law. It says, Jews were released from military duties to avoid Sabbath and dietary conflicts. And Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, says the same thing. Legal permission to rest from work and public obligations on the Sabbath. Philo, legatio ad Gaium, and talks about that. Permission to follow kosher practices and exemption from participation in civic cultic meals. That's why Paul says, all is permissible, but not all is good. I'm going to paraphrase, and I'm thinking in Spanish. The next one, Jews could collect and send the half shekel temple tax to Jerusalem without interference until the destruction of the temple. When the destruction of the temple came, then the emperor forced the Jews in all the kingdom to pay this tax instead of the temple for the half shekel, but to the temple of Jupiter, which is a huge problem. And I submit to you that if you understand this, then when you read the book of Revelation talking about the Synagogue of Satan, that's where it's mentioned for the first time. It's happening somewhere between the year 92 to 96 of the Common Era. The same time Josephus in Antiquity says that now the Christians were a tribe, not a sect, but a tribe. Their status changed. Thus, they no longer have these privileges. They were being persecuted not only by the Greco-Roman world, but also by the Jews in their synagogues, because now the Jews are basically forced to choose between the believers in Messiah, who are preaching another king, in other words, another emperor, because the Lord, Kyrios, was actually the word for a title for the emperor in the first century. And if you believe in your heart that Yeshua is your Kyrios, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you shall be saved. If you confess that Yeshua is your Kyrios. Now, the emperor, okay? So understanding that, then we can see how the Synagogue of Satan was actually, in its context, in its time frame, in its space of the first century, were the Jews who are trying to preserve all of these privileges, and they are actually turning on the believers in Yeshua who used to go to their synagogues under the same umbrella because of the privileges. They are turning on them because they don't want to lose their privileges during the persecution of Jews everywhere. Remember, after the destruction of the temple, everything changes. After the destruction of the temple, Jews are perceived completely different than it was prior to. There were problems, like in the letter of Corinth, when you have Aquila and his wife, they met Paul, and Paul is writing to the Corinthians from Ephesus, because the Corinthians, they're dealing with all kinds of crazy stuff, and he meets certain people that came from Rome because Claudius expelled them. So the issue with Messiah occurred before the destruction of the temple, specifically after Paul began to go through all the congregations, because he was teaching against the empire, the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of Rome, the peace of God versus the peace of Rome, the gospel of the Lord through Yeshua Messiah, of God through Yeshua the Messiah, versus the gospel of the Roman Empire through the emperor. Once we understand that, now the contrast is there. So I'm submitting to you that the use of the word Christian was used differently legally when they first given to them in Antioch, because they knew at that time in Antioch they were actually a subgroup of the Jews in the synagogue. But later on in the time of Josephus, when he calls them the tribe, in the year 90 to 92, when he wrote Antiquity, somewhere around there, now their status changed. because they're no longer finding the favor of the Jews, because now the Jews feel threatened to lose their privileges, and now the Romans do not see them as a subgroup of the Jews, so now they're persecuting them because they are teaching against the empire. It was an affront against the emperor. It's considered sedition and treason against the empire. That's why Paul got killed. Paul had to. He was killed because his message, if you understand it, his teaching against the empire, saying that it's the God of Israel who has the power over life and death, and that is revealed through Yeshua's resurrection, and not the emperor who all he does is persecute and kills people and murder them. Hopefully that'll make sense. Is this making sense to you guys? Let's continue. So watch. Synagogues were recognized as protected religious spaces under Roman law. Also, Jews were allowed to live according to the nomoi patria, ancestral customs, including circumcision, festivals, and purity practices. Philo says the same thing. Jewish communities often had authority to judge disputes internally according to Torah. Now, you saw that in the book of Acts. Parallel to civic legal system, exemption from military service, the right to observe the Sabbath, the right to eat, dietary laws, collection of the temple tax, legal protection of synagogues and sacred places, right to follow ancestral laws, autonomous jurisdiction in the community affairs. So let me give you some examples. In the book of Acts chapter 24, read it with me so you can follow along. It says, 5 days later, the high priest Ananias, this is Ananias ben Ananus, okay? This is a very long time after Yeshua, almost like 28 years after. It says, came down with some of the elders and an attorney called Tertullus, and they reported their case against Paul to the governor. Now, they're trying to judge Paul. Now, when Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, because of you, most excellent Felix, we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight. Talking about this people, meaning the Jews. In every way and everywhere, we welcome this with utmost gratitude. It's a language of honor and reciprocity. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness. We have, in fact, found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews. Watch this. Among all the Jews, an agitator among all the Jews, not the Gentiles, but the Jews. The ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Interesting. So in Israel, Nazarenes was a derogatory or a subgroup or a sect within the Jewish observance. And we know this because in Acts chapter 3, verse 1, John and Peter were going up to the temple to celebrate the hour of prayer. That's either 9 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, because that's when the sacrifices were done, unless it was a Musaf, which is the middle of the day for the extra offerings during the high holidays and the holy convocations. So I want you to notice the language. We have, in fact, found this man, a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, a ringleader of the sect. The word that is using is different than the one that Josephus used in the book of Antiquities in the year 92 or 93 or 96, somewhere around there, to describe the Christians. Here, they're called the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, this was called by the lawyer, Tertullus. Okay? It's not called by themselves. And that was a derogatory type term from them. He says, he even tried to profane the temple. So he even tried to profane. That happened in chapter 21 and 22. By examining him, you yourself will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accuse him. So what was the accusation? That he spoke against the temple, the Torah, and the people. That's the accusation. Okay, if you go back to Acts 21, let's go there real quickly. In the book of Acts, chapter 21, I'm going to show it to you so you know what I'm trying to tell you. The accusation was, is that 15 or is that 21? Yeah, 21. 21. Yeah. It says, fellow Israelites, help this man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people, our Torah, the law, and this place, Makom, the temple. That's the accusation. More than that, he's actually brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this place. That was the accusation. So now when you go back to the book of Acts 24, understand Paul's defense. I want you to notice what he says. Now remember, the lawyer called him the Nazarene, a sect of the Nazarene, a subgroup of the Jewish religion in the first century in Israel. That's a fact, okay? It's a part of, meaning that they were observing the Torah. They were doing what every Jew does, except that they believe in Yeshua. And by the way, we can validate this because the gospel was heard by the Sanhedrin council when Gamaliel defended them and let them go free. And they continued to preach about the kingdom of God and Yeshua in the temple. Okay, now watch. Let me go here so you can see it. It says, when the governor mentioned to him to speak, he replied, I cheerfully make my defense, knowing that for the many years you have been judge over this people. As you can find out, it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. I just quoted you the place that he was worshiping that he got arrested. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple or stirring up the crowd, either in their synagogues, or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring in against me. But this I admit to you. Pay attention to what he says. This I admit to you. According to the way which they call a sect. So who is they? They're called the Nazarenes and they're called the way. Okay? So therefore he says, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the Torah and written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience toward God and all people. So Paul is saying they called us a way. They called us the Nazarene. In the Greco-Roman world, they called us the Christians. You see, but the belief system that Paul showed a whole bunch of years after his ministry started, he believed everything the Torah says and the prophets, and he believes in resurrection. So therefore, you notice they let him go. They have no case against him. So with that being said, then, if you never knew about the privileges that the Jews had in the first century, and if you didn't know really the language of how the name Christian was used, by whom in the Gospels, then you're going to assume that Jesus was a Christian, when he wasn't. He was a Jew of the tribe of Judah. He was an Israelite. He was from actually living in Nazareth. And he was born in Bethlehem. He was not a Christian. There's nowhere in the Bible that says Jesus was a Christian. He was a Torah follower. He lived it, he observed it, he taught it. Thus the disciples the same way. That did not change until after the destruction of the temple and the persecution of the believers and the influx of Gentiles coming in, that their status changed. Now, we're not quite sure how the level of observance all the way into the first century, but I do know, however, that the reason why they were not welcomed by the Romans at the end of the first century and they were highly persecuted is because they refused to worship the emperor and imperial cult. That tells me that they are living according to Torah principles. They're not committing syncretism at that moment, at that time. That came much, much later after all of the disciples and the apostles died. So we need to know the time and space so we can understand the language, when it was given, how it was given, in what context it was given, and by whom it was given. So this is the reason why I don't call myself a Christian today. Because a Christian today as an overall religion, not as a person, as a religion and theological positions, which there are 49,000 denominations of them. So which type of Christian am I? Surely the ones that are established, they don't follow, many of them don't follow, I can't say all of them, many of them don't follow the Sabbath or eat clean or observe the feast, which are biblical commandments, which we know that in the first century were observed by Paul after the resurrection of Yeshua, just like all the other disciples. They had to. It was a commandment. And Yeshua did not come to abolish. Is this making sense to you? Can you guys make a comment to make sure that you're with me here? Is this making sense? Okay, so we have to consider the terms to understand the Bible a little bit better. So, okay, so now that I said that, we understand what it's meaning here. Let's go back to the notes. And I want to guide you through some of the information that I have. How was this used in a social and legal use? The word Cristianos. Let's break that down to understand where I'm coming from, okay? Now remember, we're not challenging your salvation. We're not judging you as a human being. That's not the point of the teaching. I'm explaining to you because people ask me all the time, well, who are you? What do you do? What do you represent? Well, I'm a believer in Yeshua who follows the Torah. I believe Yeshua is the Messiah of Israel, but I follow the Torah. I live according to the principles that he lived. You know, we look more like Jewish people, not because I submit to the Jewish religion as a dogma over Yeshua, but just because the Jews do things that I do or I do things they do doesn't mean that I'm in Judaism. Just like I do when I teach from the New Testament doesn't mean that I'm a Christian, because by and large, the Catholic Church has nothing in common with the New Testament. And many of the subgroups of the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church. This is not an attack on the people. This is an observation on the system of religion. So therefore, where do we fit? We are neither part of this religion over here or this one. That's why I called myself the Way, trying to go back to that first century context. That I look more like the Hebrews and the Jews than I do more like modern day Christians because of their observance and the way we perceive the Bible. So please understand that here is not salvation in question. It's more of defining terms to understand where the disconnect occurred and how and why there seems to be a controversy between both sides. These guys assume that we are this, and these guys assume that we are this, when in reality, we are neither. We're smack in the middle, okay? Believers in Yeshua, we have that in common with the Christians. Believers in Torah, we have that in common with the Jews. If I go into the synagogue, which I've been, I never have a problem, ever. I go in, I do the prayers, and I go. I never have a problem when I go. But if I go to a church and they find out that I believe in the Torah, they want to convert me and call me heretic. But if the Jews find out that I believe in Yeshua, they also will kick me out and call me heretic. So you see, we have the same problem. And that's really what created this whole, desire for me to know, man, when did this stuff occurred? When did the disconnect? Because in the first century, there was a unifying factor for the believers in Yeshua, in which we know that there were many Greeks actually going to the synagogues. And I really understood this when I went to Sardis in Asia Minor in Turkey. When I was studying for the city of the Revelation, Sardis, I realized that there were many people from the city who were not Jews who were actually part of the Jewish community. And I'm going like, well, they don't tell us that. People keep assuming that the Christians were meeting in houses and they never went to the synagogues. Yes, they were meeting in houses after the Jews no longer welcomed them because of the problem with the Christos. That's what they call it in Rome. That's why the Jews got expelled from Rome. And that's why Paul got arrested. Because they started going around among the Jews that there was this guy teaching another king against the decrees of Rome. Let me go there real quick. I want to show you that. I want to show you this real quick. The book of Acts chapter, I think 17. Yeah, right here, look. He travels and he passes through Amphipolis to Apollonia and came to Thessalonica. Okay? And there was a Jewish synagogue, and Paul went in, as his custom on the 3 Sabbath days, argue with them from the scripture. It was his custom. Legally is the only option he had. If he wanted to worship, he had to do it in the synagogue if he's Jewish. Because collegia, they only gave them the authority to do it within their group subgroups. Okay? It says, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to raise from the dead, saying, "This is the Messiah, Yeshua, whom I proclaim to you." Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did great many of the devout Greeks. See that? So where were the Greeks here? Can somebody put a comment there? Where were the Greeks here? Where were they meeting? Not a few of the leading women. They were actually trying to convert to the Jews so they can have the benefits of the Jewish umbrella and the benefits of the Jewish collegia. Okay? It says, but the Jews became jealous. The Jews became jealous because the people were listening to Paul. And with them, some of the ruffians, okay, in the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. Now notice, the Jews didn't do it themselves. Why? Because the Jews understood that the Roman government gave them authority solely to deal with their own Jewish stuff within the synagogue. We have a precedent for that in the book of Acts in regards to Paul when he was taken to Gallio. And Gallio dismissed them because it says, see to it, it says, according to your law, we have no jurisdiction because of the benefits. Okay? Now, I want you to notice what the Jews do. So, but the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians, look up that word, it's quite interesting. Let me see what it shows me here. It's not giving me anything. Oh, there we go. This is Thessalonica. I took that picture when I was there. It's actually around that area where all this stuff happened. Okay? It said, in the marketplace, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly. Now, this is not the assembly of the Jews. This is the assembly of the people in Thessalonica. I want you to pay attention to what they say. They attacked Jason's house. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some brothers and sisters before the city authorities, shouting, pay attention, these people have been turning the world upside down and have come here also. And Jason had entertained them as guests. They were all acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying that there is another king named Yeshua. And the people and the city officials were disturbed when they heard this. And after they had taken bail from Jason and others, they let them go. So, wait a minute. Now this passed from the Jewish synagogue to the community. And you notice that the Jews, they solicited the help of the regular community in order to attack the people. Now, have you ever read or have you ever known what a decree of Caesar is? Now, certain cities, I may be getting away from the top subject matter, but I want to read it to you. Certain cities, a lot of the majority of the cities in the Greco-Roman world that were conquered by the Romans, they also have privileges. Some of them became colonies. Some of them became autonomous, but they're still protected by Rome. Some of them became just owned by Rome. So, but in order to do so, they needed to have an oath of allegiance. Just more or less the same thing we have when we say we confess with our mouth that Yeshua is my Kyrios. In the first century, that would have been against that oath right here. That would have been an affront to this right here. Okay, so let's read it. It says, the charge labeled, let me read it here. The charge labeled against the Christians in Thessalonica was that by giving their allegiance to another king, Yeshua, they rejected the rule of the present Caesar. And Claudius, and actually in Acts 17:7 talks about that. Okay? Claudius was not the emperor for the believers. He was not the Lord. He was not the Kyrios. It was Yeshua. Okay? In the first century, that title was actually a title, Kyrios. In the Septuagint, it's always attributed to God, obviously. But about 150 years before Yeshua was born on the earth, then what happens is that title in the Republic and later in the in the Roman Empire and the Empire, it took a different definition to the Greco-Roman world. The word Kyrios became a title for the emperor, the highest honor of the kingdom. He is the Lord of the earth and the sea. Keep that in mind when you read Revelations 10. Okay? So when you keep reading here, we're going to find out. Watch. They were thereby seen as denying their oath of loyalty to him by rejecting the legitimacy of his official decrees. When both the citizens and the authorities heard these things, they were naturally very disturbed. It's according to Bruce Winter's Divine Honors, and also by another book here by Cambridge University Press, Roman and Greek East and Death of the Emperor. Such a reaction is understandable when cognizance is taking of the annual oath of loyalty sworn to the Emperor of Rome. The one sworn to Augustus on the 6th of March in the year 3 BC provides evidence of this. This is an oath they took way before Yeshua, okay? Somewhere around the same time. It says, I swear by Zeus, but by the way, just a disclaimer, I am not swearing anything to anybody except that I believe that the God of Israel is true, that the God of Israel is the creator, that the God of Israel is our king and he is our sovereign, and that he sent his son Yeshua to rule over his kingdom on the earth, and that Yeshua is the Messiah of Israel, and he is the son of the living Elohim. He is Ben Adam, he is Bar Enosh in Aramaic, he is the image of the invisible God. Anyway, so my allegiance is to the Father and to his son Yeshua as the Kyrios that he has ordained for us here on the earth. Just keep that in mind when I'm reading this. Okay? It says, I swear by Zeus, earth, sun, and all the gods and goddesses, and Augustus himself, that I will be favorably disposed towards Augustus and his children and descendants at all time of my life. I will spare neither my body, my soul, my life, my children, but in every way, for things that affect them, I will undergo every danger, and whatever I perceived or hear against them being said, or plotted or done, I will report it, and I will be an enemy to the person saying or plotting or doing any of these things. If I do anything against this oath, I pray that they may come upon myself, my body, my children, and all my family destruction, total destruction to the end of the line, and all of my descendants, and may neither the bodies of my family nor my descendants by the earth or the sea be received, or no by bear fruit from them. In the same words was this oath sworn by all inhabitants of the land in the temples of Augustus by the altar of Augustus. Wow, how many of you did not know that? That's what they mean by the decrees of Caesar. They had annual oath taking. They were completely loyal. By the way, the same structure and format you find in Deuteronomy chapter 13. Deuteronomy chapter 13 is telling you about a false prophet. And he'll tell you, if your father, your mother, your children, or your brother, they tell you, let's worship other gods. You're supposed to, because we made an oath of loyalty to God. Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. That's why. So this is nothing new. So understanding that there was an oath of allegiance, when Paul began to preach Yeshua as the Kyrios, and now the Jews are losing their own members, what do? They turn against Paul and the believers. To the people. And the people now saying, hey, they're saying there's another king. So the people they swore allegiance, they have to act according to the decrees of Caesar, of the emperor. It was the loyal thing to do to those people in the first century. That's where the Synagogue of Satan comes to play now. In the latter part of the first century, when the temple was destroyed and the persecution and the privileges of the Christians are no longer the same as the way or the Jews, because there were the Jews and then there was the way and there was the Nazarene, and there were a subgroup of Jews like Pharisees or the Sadducees. But when the temple was destroyed and now the Jews no longer wants the believers in Yeshua, even if they lived according to the Torah, they were teaching an anti-imperial message. To the Jewish people trying to preserve their status quo, they were not going to accept that. Therefore, they were turning on their own people. That's why it's called the Synagogue of the Adversary, of Satan. We forget that Satan can also mean adversary. Okay? Is this making sense to you? Is this making sense to you guys? Put a yes or a no so I know at least. Get an idea. So again, there's so much here to learn, and every time I teach this, it always takes a different turn because there's so much information. So now that we went through the Bible, and I showed you this, I want to be able to guide you through some of the terms. Let's go right through some of the terms. Hopefully you can see that okay. So the social and legal use of the term Christian in the first century. Remember, let me reiterate again. In the first century, the first, let's say 30 years, the Christian name was a derogatory type name given to the believers in Yeshua that was coined by Greeks and Romans. It was a subgroup. It was more like a legal term, not as a religious. Okay? And they know that they were under the umbrella of the Jews. Now, the Jews called them the Way, or they called themselves the Way, and the Jews in Judea called them the Nazarenes. Okay? They're following the one who was born in Nazareth. That's what it's saying. Okay? So both terms were actually given to the believers of the Way as a derogatory type term. The Jews called them the Nazarenes, and the Gentiles called them the Christians. Okay? But there's more to the story. We need to study it out. Okay. So what was the social and legal use? The name Christian emerges in the context of cities, Hellenistic with strong administration that is Roman, in Antioch of Syria. Okay? According to Suetonius and Tacitus, in the time of Nero, already there was a group clearly differentiated, which they call Christiani. Now notice when it said that. In the time of Nero. Remember, go back and find out when Nero was leading, somewhere right before late 50s, early 60s. Okay, there was a big fire in Rome that he set, and he blamed the Christians that they set the fire in Rome. So there was a huge persecution. So by this time, now we have a problem in which the believers in Yeshua are not really welcome in the Jewish synagogues anymore, and they're not really liked by the Gentiles either because of the anti-imperial message Paul was proposing. Okay, keep that in mind. Let's continue. It says, Tacitus uses it with contempt, describing them as superstitial or superstitious type of religion, illicit and dangerous for Rome. Suetonius likewise dimensions as followers of a certain Christus. That's what they call it in the first century. That was the cause of the unrest in the first century. Claudius expelled them because of the problem with Christus. In Roman law, the term became legally valid when Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, wrote to Emperor Trajan. Now remember, it became legally valid, but after Trajan. Okay, that's in the year 112, after the first century. So there were times of peace, and there was times of acceptance. There were times of persecution. There was a time in the year 225 of the Common Era that they have what is called, the Romans developed what is called a libellus. Libellus is actually a document that was the evidence, like a passport. It was the evidence whether or not the believer in Yeshua was loyal. If the Roman was loyal to the emperor, or if he was a believer. It means that particular document, it was actually letting the person know who was questioning him that person did a sacrifice and was loyal to Caesar in the imperial cult. And they used to walk around with that. Because Christians, they grew so much in the first century, and there was a distinct group, and they were known for one thing, for not worshiping the emperor, for not doing what the Romans did. But not if you don't worship the emperor and you don't worship any of the other gods of Rome, that means that you have to eat different type of meat, because the meat that were eaten in the marketplace were meat dedicated to the idols, which is a direct command in Acts 15 not to do. So we know now, according to the evidence, that all the believers in Yeshua at one point or another, until later, on the early part of the 3rd century, that then they become syncretism and mixture and everything change, in which now they eat pork. But in the 1st century and the better part of the first half of the 2nd century, they were living as Torah believers, removed from the community of the synagogue and rejected by the Romans because they were not doing what the Romans did. Okay, this is an important fact that I found, that if you search it, it's not going to take you very long to really figure it out. Okay, let's go. Let's continue. Let's talk about the identity and self-perception. The first ones, the first followers of Yeshua rarely call themselves Christians. They prefer securities as disciples, brothers, those of the way, like in Act 9:2, which says, "And asking for letters to the synagogue at Damascus, so if he found any who belong to the way, men and women, he may bring them bound to Jerusalem." So that was the name given to the believer in the 1st century, the way. Okay, this is when Paul was persecuting them. Or saints. The term Christian initially had an external character, even pejorative. It says a demeaning type term. But in the text in 1 Peter 4:16, Peter redefines it. Okay, if some suffers as Christian, do not be ashamed, but glorify God in this name. That is, a name legally and socially negative was taken as identity of honor. So in the 1st century in Asia Minor, Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and Asia, which was the place where Peter wrote to, they were using the word Christian as a derogative term to the believers in Yeshua, who were called by the way, who were in the synagogue with all the Jews. It was a subgroup. It was a sect of the Jews. Remember that. That's important. Is this making sense to you guys? Is this making sense here to my students here in the chat? Yes? Okay, good. All right, so let's continue here. So a legal connotation. In the time of Nero, in the year 64, the name Christiani served to justify persecution. So now the name became a name of persecution. In the year 112, in Pliny's letter, the year 112 AD, the simple fact of being called Christianus was punishable if the confession was maintained, because it was an anti-imperial message. Okay, in the time of Justinian, in the 6th century, the name got on appearing within category legal related to religion prohibited. Depends on what time of the year. The term, therefore, was consolidated in the empire as a legal category of persecuted religious identity, similar to judicial etiquette. So if you look at some of these resources, you will really able to see more or less the context. Now, it is important, guys, that you remember that there is a cultural background to all of this. Culturally, I am not saying that you're going to go to hell if you call yourself a Christian. I'm not saying that. That's a place of salvation, and God is the one who determines who is saved and who is not saved. But to be honest with you, personally, I don't call myself a Christian. Not because I reject Yeshua, because I fully believe Yeshua is the Messiah. You may call him Jesus, I call him Yeshua. He is the Messiah of Israel. But it's because the lifestyle that today's Christians observe, according to the Bible, does not line up with the lifestyle that it was observed by the people of the way in the 1st century. I mean, in the 1st century, they were keeping Sabbath. Even if you think they were meeting on Sunday, fine. But they were keeping Sabbath as a day of rest. Why? Because they were connected with the Jews in the first part of the 1st century. They were part of the, subgroup of Judaism in the first century. Judaism in the first century is much different than it is today. But even today, there are different groups. I mean, there are subgroups even within Judaism. You have the Karaites. There are different sects within Jewish people. Okay, you have different subgroups within even Judaism to this day. Okay, so I'm proposing to you that in the first century, according to the privileges that the emperor and Rome gave to the Jews, in which it was easier, and we see how in the first century in the book of Acts 13, Acts 14, Acts 15, Acts 17, that they were going to synagogues everywhere. Way after the resurrection, by the way. So Paul was going to the synagogue 20 some odd years after Yeshua resurrects, as his custom was. Because it was according to the law of Rome, they had the right to meet. Up to that point, believing in Yeshua was not a separating factor. I hope that makes sense. So the reason why I don't call myself a Christian, I would like to reiterate this, is not because I have anything against my Christian brothers and sisters. It's because if I call myself a Christian, the way that the word has completely developed in the lifestyle in regards to what it is observed according to the Bible, then I'm representing something the Bible is not conveying in regards to the way they lived in the first century. I hope that makes sense. Would we be able to do things that are wrong? I agree. I think we would too, because we're learning how to walk in these principles. Basically, we're moving throughout all the centuries backwards, from now into the first century. I'm finding out that the congregation of the first century spoke very differently, observed very different things, and behaved very differently than today. And you have to ask the question, if Paul will go to a church on a Sunday morning, would he recognize that church as something that he taught on the principles in Corinth and in Ephesus and in all the places he visited? Would he say that's the same message that I brought to them? That's the question you have to ask. Okay, let's continue here. Let me find some more stuff here that I have that I want to share with you. So let's look into more definitions. Definition of Christian, syntax, and the morphology in the Greek. The form is Christianos. Okay, the root, Christos, anointed or Messiah, you know that already. Ianus is very interesting, by the way. The word Ianus in the Latin functions to design belonging, that's a suffix, belonging, relationship, or loyalty to a personal leader. So Christianus in the Latin language was loyal to the Messiah. Okay? It says examples, a parallels to the Herodians. In Mark chapter 3:6, the Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against them. There were different subgroups. The Herodians were loyal to Herod. Now you understand what they call Herodians. And then you have also the ones that are supporters of Caesar. Now the syntax, the noun, the adjectival use of social ethnonym, it says one of Christ, applicable in the plural. Now the BDAG, it's a great commentary, I hope you get it. The BDAG uses and defines Christianos adherent to Christ or Christian with nuance extended, external and possibly pejorative in the first stage, meaning that in the beginning of the use of the word Christianity, it was used as a derogatory word, which I already told you that. So that's the BDAG. Please go look that up. It's probably one of the best commentaries or dictionaries on the Hebrew and the Greek. Okay? Now, Kittle in the TDNT explains that the suffix Ianus indicate a group identified with its leader. First used in language, in politician language and military, not religious. Therefore, Christian was equivalent to the supporter of Christ in the same way as Caesariani were supporters of the emperor. So again, let's repeat again the context of the use of the word Christian in the New Testament in the Greco-Roman world. Let me reiterate again. In Acts 11:26, we have when let me read it. When he had found him, he brought him up to Antioch. So it was for the entire year. So they met with the church and taught a great many people. And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. So they were there for a year, and now they are called Christians. It doesn't say anywhere that we called ourselves Christians. I'll give you that as an exercise. Look in the New Testament where any of the disciples called themselves Christians. Even Peter didn't even call himself a Christian. He called himself. He's saying, if they call you by that name, just glorify God. Don't be ashamed, because it was a shameful word towards them. Okay, if you study honor and shame, that becomes very quite clear. All right, let's continue here. Let's go on. In Acts 26:28, we're talking about in the judicial matter, and in 1 Peter 4:16 is the place where it redefines positively the identity. So look up this particular sources. The Roman sources can give you insight in all this stuff, and I think you really would enjoy it if you do this. Okay, so now intention of the term in the social society of the Greco-Roman world. Okay, politician. The suffix for Christianity implied loyalty to a rival leader of Caesar. Call someone Cristiano suggests a group that put his fidelity in a Christos other than the emperor. Please remember that the word Christos meant anointed. And to the Romans, the emperor was anointed to do that. Okay, so Christos means anointed in Greek. So you have to understand how it was used in the Greco-Roman world too. So to them is Christianos. Now they're connecting that word to the Messiah of Israel, not their Savior of the world. Soteria, soter, salvation. Savior in the Greco-Roman world was the emperor. Savior, according to the gospel, becomes Messiah, who is the Kyrios, who is the Lord, that God has placed over his creation. So that was an affront to the power of the emperor. It's chaos by saying that. It was actually sedition and treason. A Gentile would have been, someone who was not a Roman citizen, would have been crucified by saying that there's another Lord instead of the emperor. A Roman citizen who renounces the emperor and believes in Yeshua now must die by the sword, because that's committing treason. Now you know why they were dying. Because they will refuse to worship the imperial cult. By worshiping the emperor would have been against the oath of allegiance that they took, serving God in the name of Yeshua. That's what the confession is. If you confess with your mouth that Yeshua is your master, but you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. So now everyone who confesses Yeshua as their Kyrios rejects the emperor, rejects the imperial worship, rejects the imperial food, rejects the imperial festivals, rejects anything dealing with the emperor. That means they're rejecting the whole Roman system of religion. Now they are rejected by the Jews because the Jews don't want to lose their privileges. So in the first century, and this is a fact, this is not anti-Semitic, this is a historical fact. And if you think about it, if you're a Roman or a Greek Roman, and if you are a Jew who do not believe in Yeshua, and all of a sudden this guy comes around preaching another king in the middle of the Greco-Roman world, when you already have anti-Semitism, they treated the Jews as barbarians. They could not do away with the Jews in the Greco-Roman world because the Jews were so prosperous that they tolerated them because they actually brought value. But to them, according to Winters and some of the other scholars, because the Jews were so isolated, they would not meet with the people because of imperial cult. They would not have any associations with other associations, meaning guilt, trade guilds, because of the worship of other gods and eating of meat sacrificed to idols. So to the Romans, they became very weird, isolated community that didn't bother anybody. And they were weird in their observances, but they left them alone because the emperor says that. Now, the Jews don't want to lose that. They can live in a metropolis like Ephesus, and I was there, and I tell you, I understand if you're going to go to live somewhere in a metropolis, you go to New York or you go to somewhere big where they have all the benefits of merchandising or business or whatever, and they were businessmen by and large. So therefore, I understand what the Jew says. Yo, man, I don't recognize this Jesus. So get him away. You guys get away from here. If you continue to preach this anti-imperial message, it's going to cost our freedoms. Put yourself in their shoes for 1 second. You understand why they did it, because they're persecuted already. They're isolated by their behaviors and their loyalty to God and the Torah. And now they're preaching Yeshua as the Kyrios. So now they turn against them, which is a problem. And I know that's the problem. But the Romans also have another problem. They're preaching another Kyrios. They're preaching another master. And the Gentiles are renouncing the emperor. Do you ever wonder why the Roman Empire succumbed to Christianity? Have you ever even wondered why? Either believe in the Messiah of the Jews or lose their kingdom. Because that's how much they grew in the face of persecution and murder by the Roman emperor, because the Christians would not follow the imperial cult or the believers in Yeshua of the way. The emperor says, okay, I tap, I give. I'm going to convert. But what did he do? He committed syncretism. He mixed all of the elements of Roman religion within the elements of the Torah, or the believers that by that time, they were not really strictly following the Torah per se. And they gave in. And then they changed everything, and now we have Protestants and we have Catholics. And according to the Bible, the Catholic Church does not reflect the first century believer at all in any way. Okay, if you study imperial cult, you will find out really quickly that's true. Even when you go to Rome, like I did, and I got to see where the Vatican is, and I got to see what they have all around. People think this about Messiah, about Christ. It's about imperial worship. And if you know the difference, you'll recognize what I'm talking about. We have to get back to the first century understanding. Let me move on. I got more information. I need to stop in a few, maybe in about 20 minutes, okay? But I want to make sure I cover all of this. So the word in the political arena, the suffix imply loyalty to. In the social environment, in cosmopolitan cities like Antioch, it was very advanced, the term served to differentiate a subgroup Jew, a Jewish subgroup who follow the Messiah. Legally, however, in the times of Nero and then Pliny, the name acquired judicial connotation. Being a Christian was not just a religious identity, but a legally dangerous, similar to a crime and association illicit. Meaning, and the reason was because of the message of Paul, that they are now enticing people to follow another Kyrios. You may call it Kurios, but in the Greek it's a Kyrios. Okay? So what's the contrast to the way? In Acts 9:2, let's read these verses. And asking for letters to the synagogues of Damascus, so if they found any who belonged to the way. In Acts 19:9, when some stubbornly refused to believe and spoke evil of the way before the congregation, he left them, taking the disciples with him, and argued daily in the lectures hall of Tyrannus. So this is dealing with Paul. Acts 19:23. About the time no little disturbance broke out concerning the way. So it's interesting when Luke is writing, he's calling the believers the way, but when everyone else is talking, they're calling the believers, something other than. In chapter 22, verse 4, I persecuted the way up to the point of death by binding both men and women, putting them in prison. That's what Paul did in his confession. Acts 24, verse 14. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they called a sect. Wait a minute. Calling it a sect means it was a subgroup of the Jewish people in the first century. He worshiped the God of their ancestors, believing all things in the Torah and the prophets. So the internal expression or self-definition, the way, evokes from Isaiah 40, verse 3, and Isaiah 35, 8. The path of holiness and the way of the Lord. Okay, so way of life. A disciple. That's really what it meant. Unlike Christian, he had no connotation politically or illegal, dangerous, but religious and spiritual. So the distinction between the word the way, according to the way it was used, It was a subgroup of the Jews in the first century. They just believed Yeshua was the Messiah. And by the way, many people believed Yeshua was the Messiah, and it doesn't say they left to follow Torah. In the book of Acts, chapter 21 says, myriads of Jews believed and they were zealous for the law. In chapter 6, verse 7, it says that the word of the Lord, the gospel, grew in Jerusalem, and many of the priests believed. It doesn't say they stopped doing their service. It was after, when the message became anti-imperial, that it became a challenge to the believers, and that's why they were called Christians, because they saw their loyalty was to the Messiah. Okay? So let me move on here real quick. I have some more information I want to share with you. Oh, I know what. I almost forgot. So let me talk a little bit about this. Josephus uses a very interesting term. I'm going to read it to you, and then we're going to break it down. Now, Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, I'm using the William Winston. I normally like the Loeb's commentary, but on my Logos program, I don't know. Let me show you something really quickly. You see right here, if I do this, and I have all of my books, I have my whole library here. I can even add my own books on my studies. So this is my whole library, okay? See the amount of books I have in here. These are all academic stuff, Jewish books, whatever, okay? So I want to find something. So if I want to find something, I do the little, magnifying glass. If I go to the magnifying glass here, it gives me an opportunity to search. Even in my logo software is connected with what is called an AI context that is actually going to search only on my library. Either it gives me all the books that I don't have that I may need, or only the Bible. It will search only the Bible. Or it will search my books on maps or whatever I have. So let's just put books. And I go right here where it says smart. I have different options. You can do precise, smart, or whatever. But that's the AI mechanism within the Logos software. Okay? Okay. So I put in decrees of Caesar. Okay? And I hit that. It's going to go through my whole library. And I'm showing you this because I use this a lot to actually facilitate my searches on all of my academic information. It gives me a synopsis. So it said Julius Caesar issued several decrees concerning the Jews, granting them various rights and privileges. These decrees, dating from the year 47 to 44 BC, allowed Hyrcanus and his children to rule over the Jewish nation. Now, when you hit the number here, it takes me to the direct quote in Antiquities, but it does something interesting. Watch. When I click it, it takes me to the source and it highlights it for me. Okay, now if I want to translate this in Spanish for my Spanish audience, I go right here and it immediately translates it for me in Spanish, directly from the text. Or any other language that I see here. Let's say, I don't know, Arabic. It translates it into Arabic. Okay? So whatever you want to translate it into it. So now my searches are more precise. And if I want to use a synopsis, I could copy it and it gives me the outline here. So what I do, so you'll know, I do my search. Then I go to every single one of the numbers and I read it in its context. But it gets better. And then it continues underneath to give me every search of every book that I have from every source that I have on my own. Now, if I go back and I hit all, and I put all here, you're going to notice it's going to give me books that are not in my library. See, the one that I have the little lock here? It talks about it, but I don't have them. I will have to buy them. Okay, but it also gives me the decrees, Jewish Encyclopedia, validated source, So I start going through this, and then I'm able to expedite. Now you know how I find a lot of my stuff. When I put it together in a workbook area like this. I also use all the resources that allows me to get all the information that I've read. Everything that I've showed you, I've read before. It's just that I'm organizing them in, outline form for you so you can follow it. So Josephus talks about the tribe of the Christians. As you can see right there on the screen, in Antiquities of the Jews. I'd rather have the Loaves edition, but for logos, I'm using the Winston. It's not the best translation. But in book 18, I think it is. I can't remember right now, but one of those. Book 18, Antiquities of the Jews, 18, paragraph 63 and 64. And I'm going to read 64 because of time. It says, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that love him at the first did not forsake him, but he appeared them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophet had foretold these and 10,000 others wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Now, guys, they're called a sect someplace else, and here they're called Christians. So I began to search. I asked the question, when was the book of Antiquities written? When I began to do the search, you'll find really quickly why he's using the word tribe and he's not using the word sect because of the time frame that it was written. Let me find it for you guys. Okay, so this is a very important thing to understand the definitions. Okay, watch. The status of Christians in relation to the Jewish collegia, which is meeting place, when Josephus composed Antiquities in the year 93-94. Interesting. In the first part of the first century, before the destruction of the temple, they were called a sect of the Jews, of the Nazarenes or the way. Keep that in mind. And because of the laws of gathering, collegia, they had the right to fall under the umbrella of the exemptions that the Romans gave the Jews as privileges in the Roman Empire. But after the destruction of the temple and after the message of the imperial, anti-imperial message, they started to be rejected by the Jews in the synagogue because they didn't want to lose the privileges. And the Gentiles didn't want them because they were creating havoc, preaching against the emperor, which was treason. Okay, now, when I went back to look at the history when Josephus calls the Christians a tribe, that really caught my attention because the Hellenist Jews, it's called the Hellenists, which is actually a title for a Greek person today. But in the first century, the word Hellenist was also attributed to Jews in Alexandria as a tribe of Jewish people that became Hellenized, Greek cultured, but still had Jewish observance, but they had Greek names, they had Greek clothing, they were assimilated, but they were Jewish in descent. So when he calls them a tribe, that piqued my interest in something I read in Philo about 1 year and 2 years ago. So I asked a question. I started looking. And I said, where was Antiquities written? In the year 93-94. Let's read. It says, when Josephus composed Antiquities around 93-94 Common Era, okay, Jewish as a collegium licitum is a legal gathering place. In the Roman world, Judaism was recognized as a lawful association, collegium. You need to study what associations are like. There's a book I want to recommend to you. This is a primary source, by the way. And this book really helped me understand, associations in the Greco-Roman world. You need to get this book if you want to learn this. Okay? This is a very significant book. It's by Baylor Press. And you can find it on Amazon. And I really recommend it because it cites a lot of primary sources, meaning quotes. It gives you the decrees, and it tells you how the associations work in Egypt, in Asia Minor, in Greek Isles. It tells you everything. It gives you the decree and how that worked. So to understand what I'm talking about, this book will give you an idea on how this was perceived, collegia, in the first century. All right? All right, let's continue. It says, Julius Caesar, Augustus, and later emperors confirmed Jewish rights, freedom to assemble, maintain synagogues, collect the temple tax, observe Sabbath food laws, like in Josephus' Antiquities, book 14. Also, you have Philo. We talked about that earlier. This gave Jews protection under Roman law. Their synagogues function like a collegia, but the imperial charters granted them exemption. In other words, although they had the right to meet in their synagogues, but the exemptions kept them from worshiping the emperor or doing the decrees of Caesar. And that's why now in Acts chapter 17, now you get it, while they went looking in the marketplace for the people, local people, to help them persecute Jason and Paul and Silas, because they knew the Jews understood that their jurisdiction was only limited to the synagogue and things related to the Torah, not to Roman law. The moment that Paul mentioned Yeshua as the Kyrios, then that would have caused a huge problem for the church and the congregation in Thessalonica, or the synagogue in Thessalonica, with the regular people, because of the oath and the decrees to the emperors. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's continue. And it says, early Christians inside the synagogue. In the year 40 and the 60s, in the 40s and 60s, Common Era, Roman authorities generally saw believers in Yeshua as a Jewish sect. That's why they're called heresies. You need to study this out. This word is important. Okay? And it says in Acts chapter 18, verse 14 and 15, it tells you, just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to the Jews, this is in Corinth, by the way, if it were matters of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of the Jews. But since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see it to yourselves, I do not wish to be a judge in these matters. Why did he say that? Because of the privileges. So now you have the evidence that in the first century, the believers in Yeshua were actually receiving the same benefits as the Jews in those places. So they were a subgroup of the Jewish people in the first century. Okay? When I hear people say that there's no evidence that the believers in Yeshua kept the Sabbath in the first century, I have a problem with that, because the evidence points in the other direction. But we cannot disregard cultural background. And that's the problem when we have these theological differences, because we have neglected the cultural backgrounds to understand how they lived, where they lived, when they lived, and how things changed geopolitically and also socially after the destruction of the temple. Something for you to consider if you ever want to study the book of Revelation. Let's continue here. It says, for this reason, early believers likely benefited directly from the Jewish legal shield. So the Greeks were calling him, and the Romans, they were calling him Christians, and the Jews will call them Nazarenes. Okay? And the turning point in the late 60s to 90s, by the time Josephus wrote Antiquities, the year 93, 94, in Rome, the situation was shifting. Neronian persecution in the year 64, Tacitus in the Annals says, calls Christians a genus hominum, race of people, already distinguished from Jews. Remember, that's already in the year 64. They were being persecuted. In the synagogue prayers at Bikaminim, rabbinic custom, tradition 8590, Common Era, suggests a liturgical separation between Jews and Nazarene, or they call them minim. Now, let's put a question mark on this one, because I found more information that it was not necessarily redirected of the Yeshua, of the believers in Yeshua, although that might have been an influence, but I'm not quite sure. So I'm not going to put that as a direct quote correctly, because we know later on there's somebody else raised up as a Messiah and they rejected him. So, and there's also believed that this was a prayer more towards the Sadducees, not believing in eternal life and not believing in angelic majesties, like the Bible sometimes show the angel of the Lord and things like that. And also certain things that the Sadducees did. Okay, so there's a question about this one. I'm still searching it out, but I don't want to teach it as only one concrete thing because I'm still learning. Okay, so I don't want to do something that is not ethical. Let's continue. Now, Suetonius in Claudius, he says, refers to the disturbances in Rome as the instigation of Chrestus, showing Roman governor already noted a distinct movement. Thus, by the 90s in the Common Era, believers were increasingly seen as outside Judaism's collegium privileges. Now, Josephus, the vocabulary that he's using, and this is important, okay, is that, by the way, you can find this very easily. See, I go right here. Let me get this one right here. I copy. Then I go to my search. Go to the magnifying glass. Look at my books. Put it right here. Hit the return. And it finds my quote. Okay? It'll find it eventually. I don't want to just take the time because I want to move on. But so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. Okay. So when you go here, Josephus' choice of vocabulary changes. He uses tribe much later, but the Bible uses sect early on. There's a distinction. You need to know that distinction. When it says tribe, it's already implicating the believers separated themselves from the Jewish community. When it uses the word for sect, which is hieresis, okay, is basically a name used as a subgroup, like in the New Testament. It uses that to highlight the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, so let's continue here. It says, when Josephus refers to the Philon tribe or of believers in antiquities, like I read you earlier, he does not call them hieresis like a Pharisee and Sadducees, implying they were no longer considered as an intra-Jewish sect, and does not link them with a synagogue privilege. Frames them as a distinct tribe, something different, akin to a natio, which is another type ethnic body, much like Romans will later classify them. So when Josephus wrote Antiquities in the year 93-94, Christians were already living outside the protective umbrella of the Jewish collegia. Before 60, however, the believers could claim protection under the Judaism's legal status. Thus, they were considered the way. Christians by the Greco-Roman world as derogatory, but the way, or a Nazarene by the Jews. Keep that in mind. After Nero, everything changes. Believers increasingly recognized as a separatist people, genus. By the 90s, however, Josephus reflects this by calling them a tribe, acknowledging their distinct and enduring identity apart from Jewish privileges. But again, no one wanted them. You know why? Because they refused to worship the emperor. So therefore, they felt that the Christians in the Greco-Roman, the way they perceived them after the year 90, they were being persecuted because they were neither Jews, they were neither part of the Gentile religion. When you read the book of Revelation, now you understand why they needed to be forced to have them the name and the number of the beast. Because in order to survive, you needed to be part of an association. If you did not belong to an association which was linked to a god, which was linked to sacrifice to idols, which was linked to worshiping the emperor, then you cannot have a job. You cannot belong to a community. You cannot buy or sell. If they didn't belong to the Jewish collegia, which have privileges to abstain from imperial worship and be loyal to the God of Israel, and because of Yeshua becoming the anti-imperial context that Paul brought it in, they created a separation with the Jews and also separation with the Greeks and the Romans. The Romans and the Greeks did not want to break their oath of allegiance, and the Jews did not want to lose their privileges. Thus, we see a class type of battle. So I want to see if I find something quickly here. They have different things. Let's see if I find something to read to you. See, because you have a dedication. There we go. Honors by initiates of the god Dionysus for Emperor Hadrian. Okay. The altar of white marble found in the eastern portion of the sanctuary of Artemis. Now watch. It's interesting. Emperor Caesar and Trajan, Hadrian Augustus, son of God. Trajan Patricus and grandson of God Nero, greatest high priest, with tribunician power, three times consul. The initiates, the people, before the city, enthroned with Dionysus, honored him when Claudius Romulus was priest, Claudius Avius was the revealer of sacred things, and Antonius Drusus was supervisor. Now, to belong to an association, you have to accept all of that. So therefore, if you're a believer in Yeshua as your Kyrios, you reject all of that. You reject the emperor being the high priest. The book of Hebrews is saying you have Yeshua as your high priest. It's not the emperor. Yeshua became a ransom for you. The emperor has not. Yeshua now came to eliminate through his death and resurrection. God eliminate death through him. The emperor cannot do that. Understanding the associations will give you a greater insight in the problem of the first century between the term Christian and the term the way. So let's finish the teaching. So why do I not call myself a Christian today? Not because I have anything against Christian brothers and sisters, but because examining the information, the lifestyle and the way, the system of religion the Catholics follow and some of the Protestants is not according to the way they lived in the first century. The way lived differently. We have the evidence. They used to go to the synagogues. They used to read the Torah. They used to follow the Sabbath. They used to do certain things. They met in houses after they were thrown out of the synagogues. Why don't I call myself a Jew? First of all, I was not born in Judaism. I don't hold to the religion as my identity marker, although I do many things Jewish people do, because, again, in the first century, the believers in Yeshua, before the destruction of the temple, and many after, were still observing things that the Jewish people do. By the way, the observance of many of the Jews that they do today has a root from the temple. So if we're going to think about it, I would follow the things that come from temple practices, like the liturgy and like the prayers, and like to do certain things they did there. And the commandments that tells us about what to do and what not to do, because Yeshua didn't come to abolish them. So this is the reason why when people ask me, what do you do? I tell them, well, I'm a believer in Yeshua as the Messiah, and I follow the commandments of God. I neither identify with this branch, or this branch, although I have ministered, I speak with people on both sides. So you understand where I'm at, that I'm not going to using the word Christian as derogatory towards you, because I understand now that the believers in Yeshua that are Christians, they have basically inherited the structure of religion from the Catholic Church all the way down to the Protestant understanding. It's removed from its culture. It's removed from its original context. And even scholars agree with that, even if their lifestyle is something different. But when you go by the matter of information, no one can deny that the first believers in the first 40 years lived as believers in the Torah. Believe in God, believe in following Torah, and believe in Yeshua as the Messiah. The shift occurred after the destruction of the temple. And then obviously when the Catholic Church became the official, when the Christians were adopted by the emperor, who became their high priest, who became the leader of the church, who mixed in religions of the Roman Empire to the believers in Yeshua. And how do I know this is true? Go to every country where the Catholic Church has churches. If you go to Haiti, the Catholic Church, they tolerate voodoo and some of the things they do. Go to the Philippines, they see a syncretism between the local practices. Go to Mexico, the same thing. Go to South America, the same thing. It's a religion of syncretism. And sad to say, many branches of the Protestant movement has become the same. We have to be aware that there's easy to do. So what I'm trying to do with my group of study, a study group that I have, is called Disciples of the Way. We are neither saying we're better than any of both groups. What we are proposing to you is there have been disconnects between the Jewish group and the Christian group, and we hopefully become a bridge of dialogue and understanding so that we can understand one another that, yes, I identify with the Jewish people understanding Torah, and I identify with a Christian group because I recognize Yeshua as the Messiah. but the lifestyle of the Christian in regards to how they live is not lining up with how Yeshua lived his life, which he was a Torah Jewish person. The Jewish people follow Torah. They don't have Yeshua because of the storyline going on over here with the Catholic Church. So instead of finding fault on both sides, why don't we find the way to be the mediators and the bridge? If we have people trying to come back to the first century model, then the Christians will recognize, oh, so when we read in Acts, that's what you're trying to follow. Yeah, we do our best. And then when the Jewish sees us, they go like, wait a minute, don't you believe in Jesus? Yeah, we believe in Yeshua. But I keep the Shabbat like you because he kept Shabbat. You see where I'm coming from? And I think when we have the proper understanding in context, history, resources, then we can understand both sides and we can focus on our role to be a mediator in between so that we're not causing damage for what we profess and what we do. Because to be honest, we did not handle the amount of information we've received. I didn't for a long time. And some of the chaos that I see today, maybe about 20 years ago, I was part of that problem. And I had to learn to educate myself and to balance things out. But I cannot call myself something in which the lifestyle is not conducive or represents what the lifestyle of the believer in Yeshua and even the Christian in the time of Paul. The word Christian in the time of Paul, in their lifestyle, was different than some of the Christian sect that we have today and denominations that we know today. And if you disagree with that statement, then I don't know what else I can do. History is very clear on this. So we have to find a way to continue to search, find information, educate ourselves so that we can balance and we can be a blessing instead of a stumbling block like is becoming today. Well, guys, thank you for your time. I appreciate so much that you're giving me the opportunity to share this with you. I pray that it is a blessing to you. And please, don't believe me. Go back and look it all up. There's a lot more information, but I'm going to stop here. And I really want you to be blessed. My intention is that we can grow, that we can become a factor, we can become an influence of uniting the kingdom of God instead of separating it by our petty arguments and our divisions. My intent is to inform you how the term Christians was used by the Jews, by the Greco-Roman world, and how it's turned out to be today. So if you study this out and you see there's a distinction between a Christian's lifestyle in the first century, the first 30, 40 years after Yeshua died and resurrected, to what it is today, then you have a decision to make. Are we going to look like those believers in the first century? Or are we going to look like the believers that have inherited certain dogmas and customs and syncretisms that we have today on both sides? Jews also have that, as well as we do, as well as Christians. We are coming out and we're trying to understand the proper context of the Bible. May the Lord bless you and keep you guys. Remember, when you go to YouTube, subscribe, hit like, and share with others. And may this is a blessing to you. If you haven't studied this out and you have an argument, just watch the video again, okay? And go look at the information. All the sources are there. Shalom to all of you. Bye-bye.